So, families, an adolescent psychology lecture. Um, the next time you're in a bookstore, take a look at the books on the section on parent and adolescent relationships. Judging from the number of survival guides, ones like, why do they act that way? Or there's another one, get out of my life, but first can you drive me and Cheryl to the mall? Or how to survive the coming years of change. Or there's a book, yes, your teen is crazy. Or yes, your parents are crazy. You'd think, based on the titles of these books, that stress and strain between teenagers and parents is commonplace, even normal. Unlike advice books on infancy, which emphasize normative development, books for parents of teenagers tend to focus on problems. This is unfortunate for two reasons. First, the stereotype presented in these writings isn't true. And second, the more difficult parents believe, or the more parents believe in that stereotype of adolescence as difficult, the more they expect their own children to conform to it, and the worse their relationship with their teenager becomes. In other words, parents' beliefs that they're going to have a difficult time with their child once he or she enters adolescence can become what psychologists call a self-fulfilling prophecy, an expectation that is realized because we act in ways that make it happen. Okay? So if I say, like, nobody likes me, right? And I walk out there into the world with a look on my face, that doesn't invite other people into my life, then yes, it's going to seem like nobody likes me because people aren't going to be drawn to trying to talk to me if I look really grumpy, right? So in my idea that nobody likes me can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Nobody will like me because I'm going to be walking around with that look on their face. Same thing with adolescence. If we believe that adolescence is going to be this storm and stress and full of conflict, then you're almost inviting that to happen. In truth, scientific studies indicate that on average, there is a very little emotional distance between young people and their parents. Although some families have serious problems, the overwhelming majority of adolescents feel close to their parents, respect their judgment, feel that they love and care about them, and have a lot of respect for them as individuals. Sure, there are times when adolescents and parents have their problems, but there are times when younger children and their parents have problems, and when adults and their parents do too. Family problems are no more likely to occur during adolescence than at other times in the lifespan. Moreover, among teenagers and parents who report having problems, the great majority had troubled relationships during childhood, and declines in the quality of family relationship in adolescence are greatest in families where relationships were less close to begin with. Only a very small percentage of families who enjoy positive relationships during childhood develop serious problems during adolescence. So we're going to be looking at family as the context during this lecture. So let's start with kind of an outline of the topics we're going to talk about. So we're going to talk about, is conflict between teenagers and parents inevitable? We're going to talk about family relationships at adolescence, and then family relationships and adolescent development. So let's start. Is conflict between teenagers and parents inevitable? It is impossible to discuss adolescents' relationships with their parents without talking about parent-adolescent conflict, a topic that not only dominates popular writings on this stage of life, but also has been the focus of decades of research by scholars. So the generation gap, fact and fiction. Most people believe that adolescents and adults hold different values and attitudes, but this is not the case. Teenagers and their parents usually have surprisingly similar beliefs about such things as the importance of hard work, educational and occupational ambitions, and the personal characteristics and attributes that they think are important and desirable. So just think about the family you grew up in. What are your family values? You have some very strong family values that your parents have for the family that you've, adopted for yourself as well, right? Indeed, when it comes to basic core values concerning religion, work, education, and so on, diversity within the adolescent population is much more striking than are the differences between the generations. Why is this so? Because adolescents and their parents share a common social, regional, and cultural background, and these are the factors that shape our central beliefs. Think about that Bronfenbrenner circle, the ecological model that I showed you a few lectures ago, and just think about all of those influences that are part of that individual, and family is one of them. But all, the church or the synagogue, religion in general, living in America, all of these different things are at play into what makes up that individual. But the family is most closest to the individual, more so than the school, more so than America, right? So the family values are going to be very strong, very similar for the individual within the family than for the individual compared to someone outside of that family. Although there isn't much of a gap between the generations when it comes to basic values, there is often one between teenagers and adults in matters of personal taste, most clearly evident in styles of dress, preferences in music, and leisure activities. Unlike basic values, which develop gradually over time and are shaped from an early age, preferences and tastes for things like clothing, music, and recreational pursuits are far more likely to change with the fads and the fashions. Adolescents are more likely to be influenced by their friends than by their parents in these matters, and as a consequence, parents and teenagers often disagree about them. Because adolescents spend a great deal of time with their friends, and because much of that time is spent in activities in which taste in clothes, music, and so on is important, teenagers' preferences are likely to be shaped to a large measure by forces outside of the family. This also means that the size of the generation gap will fluctuate from one historical epoch to the next. For example, a study of nearly 200,000 European adolescents from 16 nations found, for example, that the percentage of adolescents who perceive communication with their parents as difficult increased during the mid-1990s and declined between the late 1990s and the mid-2000s. Moreover, although the countries varied in their economic, political, and cultural climates, the pattern of change was similar across the countries studied. So, what do adolescents and parents usually fight about? If parents and teenagers typically don't argue over big issues, what do they fight about? They squabble about things like curfews, leisure time activities, clothing, and the cleanliness of their bedrooms. These have been the major sources of disagreement in families with teenagers for at least as long as scientists have been studying the issue. And although conflict between adolescents and parents over these mundane matters is generally less frequent in ethnic minority than in white families, the topics of disagreement are similar across ethnic groups and cultures. A study of adolescents in the People's Republic of China and Hong Kong, for example, found that the most common sources of conflict between adolescents and parents were everyday issues such as their time spent on schoolwork, household chores, and choice of friends. Why do parents and teenagers argue over such mundane things? According to several studies, a major contributor to adolescent parent bickering is the fact that teenagers and their parents define the issues of contention very differently, a finding that has been replicated across many cultural and ethnic groups. Parents view many issues as matters of right and wrong, not necessarily in a moral sense, but as matters of custom or convention. So adolescents, in contrast, are likely to define these same issues as matters of personal choice. So personal choice is much more behind their belief system and what they're fighting about, what they're arguing about. So, for example, remember the parent is going to be looking at things as a matter of right or wrong, and the child, the adolescent, via personal choice, right? So a mother who disapproves of her daughter's clothing says, people just don't dress that way to go to school. And the daughter is going to respond, maybe you wouldn't dress this way, but I do. So contrary to the stereotype, though, adolescents rarely rebel against their parents just for the sake of rebelling. In fact, they are willing to accept their parents' rules as legitimate when they agree that the issue is a moral one. So when it comes to morals, like, is it permissible to cheat on a school test? They'll agree on a moral level with their parents. If it's involving safety, like whether it's permissible to drink and drive, they're going to accept more or less what their parents are saying on those issues, right? But they are less inclined to accept their parents' authority when they view the issue as personal. What clothes to wear to the party, for example, or what boy to date, right? Those kinds of things about personal choice are going to be topics that they're going to get in more of a conflict about. In other words, rather than resisting all of their parents' attempts to make and enforce rules, the stereotype that many people have of teenagers, which is not true, adolescents distinguish between rules they think their parents have a right to make. For example, having to let their parents know what time they'll be home after going out, and rules that they think are out of bounds. For example, having to keep their bedroom orderly or cleaned up. A distinction that in many ways is quite understandable. Of course, there are differences among adolescents in the extent to which they believe their parents have the authority to regulate various sorts of decisions. Adolescents who see parents as having more legitimate authority have fewer behavior problems. Not surprisingly, adolescents who are less likely to believe that their parents have a right to know how they spend their time are more likely to conceal their activities from them. So conflict between parents and children increases during early adolescence. One reason for this is that adolescents come to see more and more issues than they previously saw as legitimate for their parents to regulate as matters of personal choice. So, for example, how late they could stay up on school nights, that kind of thing may have been like, okay, my parent has the right to do that when I'm like 9, but then when they hit that pre-adolescence around the age 9, 10, 11, 12, they're getting up there into adolescence, they start to say like, wait, personal choice, I should be able to decide when I go to bed, right? So that this finding has been replicated in numerous parts of the world, including North America, South America, Asia, and among both white and black adolescents in the United States. When parents attempt to regulate what adolescents believe are personal issues, teens are likely to describe their parents as being overly controlling. Perhaps because of this, the effects of feeling psychologically controlled by their parents, which has a negative impact on adolescents' mental health, are very different from the effects of feeling that their parents simply want to know where they go and what they do, which has a positive impact. Adolescents who think their parents are over-controlling are likely to become oppositional. How parents get their information also matters. Snooping, as opposed to talking, is likely to lead to problems, as does close parental monitoring in the absence of a warm parent-adolescent relationship. In other words, teenagers and their parents often clash more over the definition of the issue, whether something is a matter of safety rather than a matter of personal choice, for example, than over the specific details. They're not clashing. They're clashing over the definition of the issue. The struggle then is over who has the authority and whose jurisdiction the issue falls into. Because early adolescence is a time when adolescents' reasoning abilities are changing. Remember, there's a cognitive change where adolescents are now able to think in the hypothetical, right? So because of that reasoning ability changing, the ways that individuals understand family rules and regulations change as well. As a consequence of normal cognitive development, a 9-year-old child who is willing to accept his parents' views who doesn't question his mother when she says, "We do not leave clothes on the floor," grows into an adolescent who understands that some issues are matters of personal choice rather than social convention. So they'll say something like, "It's my room, so why should it bother you?" One manifestation of this change is in perspective is an increase with age in adolescents' willingness to lie to their parents. In one study in which adolescents were presented with hypothetical situations and asked whether it was acceptable to lie to one's parents about a personal matter, like dating someone your parents dislike, about half of the younger adolescents, the 12 to 14-year-olds, said it was acceptable to lie, whereas more than 80% of the older adolescents, the 15 to 17-year-olds, did. Okay? So partial disclosures or lies of omission are especially common. This one 14-year-old explained, this is what the 14-year-old said, "I just tell my mother where we'll be going and stuff. And if we're going to stay out late and stuff like that, I don't tell her none of that. Like if we're going to go to the mall, I just don't tell her that we're going to the party." So, there's some like sneaking around and bending the truth. They like leave out the part that when they go to the mall, they're also going to leave the mall, right? So, not exactly lying, but not exactly telling the truth, right? Okay. Family relationships at adolescence. Although it is incorrect to characterize adolescence as a time of high conflict in most families, it is important to keep in mind that adolescence is nevertheless a period of change and reorganization in family relationships and daily interactions. As they develop, adolescents spend increasingly less time in family activities, especially in activities with the family as a group. So, a time of reorganization and change, right? Family systems theory, I put the definition up here. It's a perspective on family functioning that emphasizes interconnections among different family relationships, such as the marital relationship, parent-child, sibling. And often there's like a way of the family kind of balancing, they balance things out. So, if a child is, there's like one example in family systems theory is if a child is real sick and has been sick for many, many years and then all of a sudden is cured and everything gets better, the family has some way of balancing that out where then someone else gets the focus. Like there has to be some sort of balance because that's how the family is able to kind of function. There's always this this focus on the sick person or whatever, and that's how they've gotten along all this time. Well, something happens sort of in a similar way to when an adolescent comes. The adolescent who was typically spending time with the family is now out with their peers, right? So they're spending more time with their friends. So the family is going to go through sort of like this adjustment. Like, how are we going to adjust how our family functions if something about our family has changed, right? So according to family systems theory, relationships and families change most dramatically during times when individual family members or the family circumstances are changing because it is during these times that the family's equilibrium often is upset. So that's what I'm talking about, that family balance, that equilibrium. Not surprisingly, one period in which family relationships usually change a great deal is adolescence. One study of interactions between adolescent boys and their parents found that the peak time for this was around age 13 or 14. The researchers speculate that because some of this transformation may be driven by puberty in families with girls, this disequilibrium is more likely to occur earlier, around the age of 11 or 12. Adaptation to adolescence may be especially difficult when the teenager is emotionally rigid or temperamentally difficult. The specific concerns and issues characteristic of families at adolescence arise not just because of the changing needs and concerns of the young person, but also because of the changes in the adolescent's parents and in the needs and the functions of the family. You already have an understanding of the biological, cognitive, and some social changes that adolescents go through and how these may affect the family system. But to fully understand the family relationships during the adolescent years, you have to take into account characteristics of the parents and the families at this stage as well. So, because they're, we don't live in isolation. Like Bronfenbrenner's ecological model, we are working in this larger system. So within our families, how are our parents and what they're going through affecting what it's like to be an adolescent? How are, um, how's the economy of America affecting the individual or the way families are able to function? All these things interplay, right? So the first part that we're going to talk about that has an effect on adolescents is the adolescent's parents at midlife, okay? Because people most typically have their first child around age 30. Most parents are in their early 40s when the first child enters early adolescence. This age can be a potentially difficult time for many adults, whether they have children or not. Some theorists have gone so far as to describe it as a midlife crisis, which I define there for you. So if we look at the nature of the midlife crisis in some detail, we see that the developmental concerns of parents and adolescents are complementary. Consider like for a moment like the issue of biological change. So at the same time that adolescents are entering into a period of rapid physical growth, sexual maturation, and ultimately the period of the lifespan that society has labeled one of the most physically attractive, their parents are beginning to feel increased concern about their own bodies, about their physical attractiveness, and about their sexual appeal. So you got this teenager who's like supposedly so attractive in society standards, and then you've got this person who's in their midlife who's like starting to question their own attractiveness, right? And both of these people are living in the same household together, right? So, one mother of an early adolescent girl once remarked in an interview with a research staff that it was jarring to realize that when she and her daughter walked down the street, men now looked at her daughter and not at her. So, a second overlap of crisis concerns perceptions of time in the future. So, at the same time that adolescents are developing that capability to think systematically about the future, they're like thinking like, what am I going to do with my life, right? Like, what job am I going to have? They're thinking about all these identity issues that we were talking about. They're thinking about the future. They start looking ahead. Their parents in this midlife time are beginning to feel that possibilities for changing their own lives are limited. Before midlife, individuals tend to measure time in terms of how long they have been alive, right? But after midlife, they are more likely to start thinking like how much longer they have to live. So they might say, like, in the next 40 years, what do I want to accomplish if they think they're going to live until they're in their 80s, right? One reason for the shift may be that at midlife, adults are reminded of their mortality because they see their own parents aging. Okay, so that awareness causes them to start thinking possibly more into how much I've left, not how much I have behind me. Whatever the reason, the naive optimism of adolescence that like I can conquer the world attitude and I could be anything I want to be attitude that adolescents tend to have, like I'm going to go to college and I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that, that naive optimism, as you might call it, clashes with the person in midlife who's kind of like got a more a more limited view onto what the possibilities are for the future. So they can clash in that way. Finally, consider the issue of power, status, and entrance into the roles of adulthood. Adolescence is the time when individuals are on the threshold of gaining a great deal of status. Their careers and marriages lie ahead of them. Their choices seem limitless. For their parents, many choices have already been made, some successfully, others perhaps less so. So most adults reach their occupational plateau, the point at which they can tell how successful they are likely to be during midlife, and many must deal with whatever gap exists between their early aspirations and their actual achievements. In some, for adolescents, this phase in the family life cycle is a time of boundless horizons, while for their parents, it means coming to terms with choices made when they were younger. This overlap of crises is likely to have an impact on family relationships. A father who is worried about his own physical health may suddenly feel uncomfortable about playing one-on-one basketball games with his growing son or daughter, as they did for years when they were younger, right? An adolescent girl with big plans for the future may find it difficult to understand why her father seems so cautious and narrow-minded when she asks him for advice. An adolescent boy may find his mother's constant attention annoying, and he doesn't see that to her, his interest in independence signifies the end of an important stage in her career as a parent. The adolescent's desire for independence appears to be especially stressful for parents. This generalization about the collision of adolescence and midlife must be tempered, though. The average age of marriage has increased, and proportionately more couples today are delaying childbearing until they have become established in their careers. As a consequence, adults tend to be older today when their children reach adolescence than was the case 2 decades ago. How being an older parent affects relationships during adolescence hasn't been adequately studied. In families with middle-aged adults, adjusting to adolescence may take more of a toll on the mental health of parents than their adolescents. Nearly 2/3 of mothers and fathers describe adolescence as the most difficult stage of parenting, and this period is the low point in parents' marital and life satisfaction. Parents who are deeply involved in work outside the home or who have an especially happy marriage may be buffered against some of these negative consequences. However, whereas single mothers may be especially vulnerable to them. In fact, a strained relationship between a midlife parent and his or her adolescent child may drive the parent to devote relatively more time to work. At the same time, studies show that parents' mental health problems affect the way they interact with their adolescents, which in turn adversely affects the teenagers. The notion that parents' mental health declines when they enter the empty nest stage is a myth, especially among mothers. Empty nest meaning like all the children leave home and then there's this empty nest, right? And it's just now the mom, or it's the mom and the dad, or it's just the dad or whatever, or the parents are just left at home without the children, right? So the notion that parents' mental health declines when they enter this empty nest, it's a myth, especially among mothers, right? So parents' mental health is worse when their teenage children are living at home than it is once they have moved out. And when children leave home, it is fathers, not mothers, who typically feel the greatest sense of loss. Okay, so then the next bullet point that we're looking at is the changes in family needs and functions. It is not only individual family members who undergo change during families' adolescent years. The family as a unit changes as well in its economic circumstances, its relationship to other social institutions, and its functions. Family finances are often strained during adolescence. Children grow rapidly during puberty, and clothing for adolescents is expensive. Keeping up with the must-haves of the peer culture, the designer clothes, smartphones, so forth, not to mention car expenses if you're lucky enough to have a parent who buys you a car as a teenager. All these things may push a family budget to the limit. Many expenditures, such as the adolescent's college education, some families start saving for those large anticipated expenses. In some families, parents may find themselves having to help support their own parents when their children are still economically dependent. The financial demands placed on parents in the sandwich generation, that is, they're sandwiched between their adolescent children and their aging parents, requires considerable adjustment. The adolescent's family also must cope with the increasing importance of the peer group. During elementary school, the child's social world is fairly narrow. The family is the central setting. During late childhood and early adolescence, however, the peer group becomes a setting in which close ties are forged, and parents and adolescents often argue about the teenager's reluctance to give up time with friends for family activities. How adolescents and parents adjust to this shift in orientation varies across ethnic groups. Since certain cultures are more likely to stress family obligations like helping with household chores than others, um, so, let me back up. Some cultures are just more willing to stress family obligations, right? So up here on the slide, you'll see two definitions that we're going to go over here in a second. So pay close attention to those. So many immigrant families place an especially high value on familism. It's an orientation toward life in which the needs of one's family take precedence over the needs of the individual. Adolescents who value familism and assist their families are less likely to get depressed and less likely to get involved with antisocial peer groups, which lessens their chances of drinking or using illicit drugs. But sometimes parents' ideas about family responsibilities clash with the more individualistic orientation characteristic of many mainstream American families. Different expectations between immigrant parents and teenagers are a significant source of stress for adolescents and parents alike, especially when the adolescent is more Americanized and the parents are less so, which is a phenomenon known as generational dissonance. Studies of Mexican American families, for example, have found that stress and family conflict are higher in Latino families with relatively more acculturated adolescents. Different expectations about the adolescent's social life can cause problems between the newly arrived immigrants and their teenagers. Important changes in family functions also take place during adolescence. During infancy and childhood, the functions and responsibility of the family are clear. There's nurturance, protection, and socialization. While all of these are still important during adolescence, adolescents are in need of support more than nurturance, of guidance more than protection, and of direction more than socialization. Making the transition from the family functions of childhood to the family functions of adolescence is not necessarily easy, especially in contemporary society where preparation for adulthood, which is one of the chief tasks of adolescence that was once carried out primarily by the family, is increasingly performed by other institutions such as school. Many parents feel at a loss to figure out what their role is during adolescence. It's important that they know that having close family relationships is just as important in adolescence as it was in childhood. Transformations in family relations. So together, the biological, cognitive, and social transitions of adolescence, the changes experienced by adults at midlife, and the changes undergone by the family during this stage set in motion a series of transformations in family relationships. There is a movement away from patterns of influence and interaction that are asymmetrical and imbalanced towards ones in which the parents and adolescents are on a more equal footing. Early adolescence, when this shift towards more egalitarian relationships first begins, may be a time of temporary disruption in family relationships. So there's changes in the balance of power. So during early adolescence, young people begin to try to play a more forceful role in the family, but parents may not yet acknowledge the adolescent's input. Young adolescents may interrupt their parents more, but have little impact. By middle adolescence, however, teenagers act and are treated much more like adults. They have more influence over family decisions, but they do not need to assert their opinions through interruptions and similarly immature behavior. Increases in the assertiveness and influence of adolescents as they get older reflect their changing needs and capabilities. To adapt to the changes triggered by the child's entrance into adolescence, family members must have some shared sense of what they are experiencing and how they are changing. Yet, parents and teenagers often live in very separate realities, perceiving their day to day experiences in a very different way. So, for a mother and son, for example, may have a conversation about schoolwork. She may experience the conversation as simply a serious discussion. We are going to sit down and have a serious discussion. But he may perceive it as an argument. One study of Black families in which mothers, teenagers, and researchers all rated a videotape of the mother and teenager having a discussion found that the teenagers rated their mother's behavior far more negatively than did either the mother or the researcher. One interesting finding to emerge from recent research on brain maturation in adolescence is that young adolescents may be especially sensitive, perhaps even overreact to the emotional signals given off by others. A parent may speak to an adolescent in a very serious voice, but the adolescent may experience it as anger. The adolescent's biological and cognitive maturation likely plays a role in unbalancing the family system during early adolescence. Family relationships change during puberty, with adolescents and their parents bickering more frequently and feeling less close. Although puberty seems to distance adolescents from their parents, it is not associated with familial storm and stress. Rates of outright conflict between parents and children are not dramatically higher during adolescence than before or after. Rather, disputes between parents and teenagers are typical of the sorts of arguments people have when a more powerful person, the parent, is trying to get a less powerful one, the adolescent, to do something. Similarly, the diminished closeness is more likely to be manifested in increased privacy on the part of the adolescent and less physical affection between teenagers and parents, rather than any serious loss of love or respect between them. The distancing that takes place between parents and teenagers in early and middle adolescence is temporary. Parent-child relationships tend to become less conflicted and more intimate during late adolescence and show no decline in closeness as the adolescent enters young adulthood. If anything, identifying with and feeling responsible for one's family increases during the early 20s. Nevertheless, the bickering can take a toll on parents and teenagers' mental health. Some studies have found that individuals who reported more conflict with their parents during adolescence had more problems both later in the adolescence and in young adulthood. Although it is certainly possible that adolescents who have problems are more likely to provoke conflict with their parents, studies that have been able to separate cause and effect have found that family conflict actually leads to the development of mental health problems and emotional distress regardless of ethnicity. Conflict at home spills over into the adolescent's school life and relationships with friends, causing problems and emotional distress. In some families, adolescents and parents even disagree about what they argue about. Patterns of conflict and closeness in the family at adolescence vary across ethnic groups. In Asian households, there's an increase in conflict, as in non-Asian families, but not until later in adolescence. Another study comparing Black families with white families found that white parents tended to give adolescents relatively more autonomy over decisions, although opportunities for adolescent decision-making increased in both ethnic groups over time. Because the disagreements parents and adolescents have typically revolve around issues of parental control, patterns of squabbling and bickering may vary across cultural groups whose timetables for adolescent independence differ. Patterns of conflict and closeness in immigrant families often differ as a function of the family's degree of acculturation. One study of Mexican American families found lower rates of parent-adolescent cohesion during mid-adolescence among more highly acculturated families than in less Americanized ones, probably because in traditional Mexican families, adolescents are less likely to challenge their parents. Similarly, conflict is less frequent and cohesion higher in households where teenagers and their parents communicate in their native language. Parental monitoring appears to be more important in ethnic minority families in which the adolescent has a weaker ethnic identity, consistent with the idea that adolescents who are more Americanized may need more vigilant parents to keep them out of control. In any case, the first half of adolescence may be a more strained and distant time for the family than earlier or later, although this may be more true in the case of firstborns than in the case of later borns, perhaps because parents may learn from experience. Part of the problem is that conflicts between teenagers and parents tend to be resolved not through compromise, but through one party giving in or walking away, neither of which enhances the quality of the relationship or contributes to anyone's well-being. As relationships between parents and adolescents become more egalitarian, they get better at resolving conflicts. Several researchers have studied changes in adolescents' cognitive abilities and how these changes may reverberate throughout the family. We noted that changes in the way adolescents view family rules and regulations may contribute to increased conflict between them and their parents. Early adolescence is also a time of changes in youngsters' view of family relationships and in family members' expectations of each other. A child may enter adolescence expecting that it will be a time of great freedom, whereas the parents may view the same period as one in which tighter reins are necessary. Another child, perhaps influenced by television sitcoms portraying nothing but happy families, may imagine that adolescence will be a time of increased closeness and shared activities in the family, only to find that his or her parents have been looking forward to having time to themselves. So it is easy to see how differences in expectations can escalate into arguments and misunderstandings. When questioned about whether adolescents were expected to disclose secrets to their parents, for example, adolescent expectations for secrecy were much greater than their parents. Sex differences in family relationships, the last bullet on this slide. Differences between the family relations of sons and daughters are minimal. Although there are occasional exceptions to this rule, sons and daughters report comparable degrees of closeness to their parents, amounts of conflict, types of rules and disagreements about those rules, and patterns of activity. Observational studies of interactions between parents and adolescents indicate that sons and daughters interact with their parents in remarkably similar ways. Teenagers relate very differently to mothers and fathers, though. Across many ethnic groups and cultures, adolescents tend to be closer to their mothers, to spend more time alone with their mothers, and to feel more comfortable talking to their mothers about problems and other emotional matters. As a consequence, mothers tend to be more involved than their fathers in their adolescents' lives. Fathers often rely on mothers for information about their adolescents' activities, but mothers rarely rely on fathers for this. Fathers are more likely to be perceived as relatively distant authority figures, to be consulted for objective information such as help with homework, for example, but not for emotional support. Interestingly, adolescents also fight more often with their mothers than with their fathers and perceive mothers as more controlling, but this does not appear to jeopardize the closeness of the mother-adolescent relationship. Although adolescents spend about twice as much time with their mothers as with their fathers, time spent with fathers, perhaps because it's a relative rarity, is more predictive of adolescents' social competence and feelings of self-worth. Family relationships and adolescent development. So thus far we've looked at the sorts of issues and concerns faced by most families during the adolescent years. In our focus on the experiences that families have in common, we have not discussed how relationships differ from family to family and whether these differences have consequences for the adolescent. Some parents are stricter than others. Some adolescents are given a great deal of affection, while others are treated more distantly. In some households, decisions are made through open discussion and verbal give and take. In others, parents lay down the rules and children are expected to follow them. Are different patterns of family relationships associated with different patterns of adolescent development? Are some styles of parenting more likely to be associated with healthy development than others? You may have learned about this in a human development class or in your intro to psych class, but we're going to talk a little bit more about it as it relates to teenagers. So before we try to answer those questions, several cautions are in order. Although we tend to see children's behavior as the result of their parents' behavior, socialization is a two-way street. Just as parents affect their adolescents' behavior, adolescents affect how their parents behave. Harsh discipline leads to increases in adolescent behavior problems, but when adolescents behave badly, parents respond by becoming more punitive, over-controlling, or detached. This interplay between parenting and adolescent development is so strong that it even contributes to the transmission of parenting styles across generations. In addition, various types of parenting affect different adolescents differently. For example, although adolescents whose parents are hostile or aloof are more likely to exhibit antisocial behavior, the link between negative parenting and adolescent problem behavior is stronger among teenagers who are temperamentally more impulsive. Among adolescents who are more timid, the same sort of parenting leads to anxiety and depression. Furthermore, adolescents who have a greater genetic risk for developing problems by virtue of their family history are more likely to evoke from their parents the sort of behavior that has been shown to lead to the development of problems. So, parenting styles and their effects. So, there are a variety of ways to characterize parents' behavior towards their children. One of the most useful approaches derives from the work of psychologist Diana Baumrind, 1978. It was the approximate year of her classification of parenting styles. According to her, there's two aspects of the parent's behavior towards the adolescents that are critical. Parent responsiveness, which is up on your slide, and parental demandingness, which is also up on your slide. Parental responsiveness is the degree to which the parent responds to the child's needs in an accepting and supportive manner. Parental demandingness is the extent to which the parent expects and demands mature, responsible behavior. And parents vary on each of these dimensions. Some are warm and accepting, while others are unresponsive and rejecting. Some are demanding and expect a great deal, while others are permissive and demand very little. In fact, you can organize it in a chart, essentially, where the levels of demand and responsiveness are charted out. And we've got a permissive type of parenting up where they've got high responsiveness but low demand, right? And authoritative has high responsiveness and high demand. The neglecting uninvolved has a low responsiveness and a low demand, and the authoritarian has a high demand and a low responsiveness. But these four words aren't the exact way we're going to classify it in our discussion. The four ways are authoritative, which was the high responsiveness and high demand, right? Authoritarian, which was on that chart, that was the low responsiveness and high demand. But instead of the word permissive, we're going to use indulgent parent. And so indulgent parents, you should know, are sometimes called permissive, and that would be the high responsiveness and the low demand, okay? And the indifferent parent is the word we're going to use, but sometimes it's called the neglectful or uninvolved. That's what was on the chart. And that would be the low responsiveness and the low demand. Okay? Because parental responsiveness and demandingness are more or less independent of each other, that is, it's impossible for a parent to be demanding without being responsive, and vice versa. It's impossible to look at various combinations of these two, or it is possible to look at various combinations of these two dimensions. Many studies of parents and children indicate that the fourfold classification of, these four that you see in front of us are very important in understanding the impact of parents' behavior on the child. And psychologists have given labels to the four different prototypes in this way. Okay, parents who are both responsive and demanding are authoritative. Authoritative parents are warm but firm. I've heard it called like kind and firm. Okay, they set standards for their child's conduct but form expectations consistent with the child's needs and capabilities. They value the development of autonomy and self-direction but assume the ultimate responsibility for their child's behavior. Authoritative parents deal with their child in a rational, issue-oriented manner, frequently engaging in discussion over matters of discipline. Authoritative parents strive to raise a child who's self-reliant with a strong sense of initiative. Parents who are very demanding but not responsive are authoritarian. These types of parents value obedience and conformity. They tend to favor more punitive, absolute, and forceful discipline. There's a verbal give and take is not common because authoritarian parents believe that children should accept their parents' rules and standards without question. They don't encourage independent behavior and instead place a good deal of importance on restricting the child's autonomy. Authoritarian parents place a premium on compliance. A parent who is very responsive but not at all demanding is indulgent. Indulgent parents behave in an accepting, benign, and more passive way in matters of discipline. They demand very little, giving the child a high degree of freedom to act as he or she wishes. Indulgent parents believe that control is an infringement on children's freedom that may interfere with healthy development. Instead of actively shaping their child's behavior, indulgent parents are more likely to view themselves as resources for their child. Indulgent parents are especially concerned with raising a happy child. Parents who are neither demanding nor responsive are called indifferent. Indifferent parents do whatever. So the indifferent would be in the neglecting, uninvolved type. The indifferent parents do whatever is necessary to minimize the time and energy they must devote to interacting with their child. In extreme cases, indifferent parents may be neglectful. They know little about their child's activities and whereabouts, show little interest in their child's experiences at school or with friends, and rarely converse with their child, rarely consider their children's opinion. Rather than raising their child according to a set of beliefs about what is good for the child's development, as do the other three types, indifferent parents structure their home life primarily around their own needs and interests. The power of authoritative parenting. So few areas of research in the field of adolescent psychology, adolescent development have received so much attention as the link between what parents do and how adolescents turn out. And the findings of this body of work are amazingly consistent. Young people who have been raised in authoritative households are more psychologically mature than peers who have been raised in authoritarian, indulgent, or indifferent homes. Adolescents raised in authoritative homes are more responsible, self-assured, creative, intelligent, intellectually curious, socially skilled, and academically successful. Adolescents, I should take away intelligent, not intelligent, but intellectually curious is more precise. Adolescents raised in authoritarian homes, in contrast, are more dependent, more passive, less socially adept, less self-assured, and less curious. Adolescents raised in indulgent homes are less mature, less responsible, and more conforming to their peers. Adolescents raised in indifferent homes are often impulsive and more likely to be involved in delinquent behavior and in precocious experimentation with sex, drugs, and alcohol. Although it generally is not a good thing for parents to disagree about how they raise their teenagers, Studies show that it is better to have at least one authoritative parent than two non-authoritative ones who share the same point of view. The link between authoritative parenting and healthy adolescent development has been found in studies of a wide range of ethnicities, social classes, and family structures, not only within the United States, but also in parts of the world as diverse as Iceland, the Czech Republic, India, China, Israel, Switzerland, Palestine. The evidence favoring authoritative parenting is so strong that some experts have suggested that the question of which type of parenting benefits teenagers the most need not be studied anymore. Educational programs designed to teach parents how to be more responsive and more demanding have been shown to foster healthy adolescent development and behavior. At the other extreme, parenting that is indifferent, neglectful, hostile, or abusive has harmful effects on adolescents' mental health and development, leading to depression and a variety of behavioral problems. Severe psychological abuse appears to have the most deleterious effects. Why is authoritative parenting so consistently associated with healthy adolescent development? First, authoritative parents provide an appropriate balance between restrictiveness and autonomy, giving the adolescent opportunities to develop self-reliance while providing the standard limits and guidelines that teenagers still need. Authoritative parents are more likely to give children more independence gradually as they get older, which helps children develop self-reliance and self-assurance. Because of this, authoritative parenting promotes the development of adolescents' competence and enhances their ability to withstand a variety of potential negative influences, including stress and exposure to antisocial peers. Second, because authoritative parents are more likely to engage their children in verbal give and take, they are likely to promote the sort of intellectual development that provides an important foundation for the development of psychosocial maturity. Authoritative parents are less likely than other parents to assert their authority by turning adolescents' personal decisions, such as over what type of music they listen to, into moral issues. Family discussions in which decisions, rules, and expectations are explained help the child understand social systems and social relationships. Some even go as far as saying that they have like a family meeting where they sit down and they like go over decisions together as a family, and it teaches children and adolescents, decision making and being part of a bigger network of systems and how things work out in the real world, as they say. This understanding plays an important role in the development of reasoning abilities, theory of mind, moral judgment, and empathy. You start to see other people's points of view in these discussions, and that can be good for their development. Third, because authoritative parenting is based on a warm parent-child relationship, adolescents are more likely to identify with, admire, and form strong attachments to their parents, which makes them more open to their parents' influence. Having regular family meals appears to have a strong protective effect, although it is the quality of the parent-adolescent relationship rather than the frequency which families eat together that matters. Adolescents who are raised by non-authoritative parents often end up having friends their parents disapprove of, including those involved in problem behavior, and adolescents who are forced to spend time with parents they don't get along with do not benefit from joint activities. Finally, the child's own behavior, temperament, and personality shape the parenting practices. Children who are responsible, self-directed, curious, and self-assured elicit warmth, flexible guidance, and verbal give and take. In contrast, children who are irritable, aggressive, dependent, or immature may provoke behavior that is excessively harsh, passive, or distant. Parents enjoy being around children who are responsible, independent, and willing to tell them about their activities and whereabouts, and they treat them more warmly as a result. Although parental monitoring does deter adolescent problem behavior, some of what often appears to be effective parental monitoring may actually be the end result of a warm parent-adolescent relationship in which the adolescent willingly discloses information. In contrast, children who are continually acting up, making their parents short-tempered, impatient, or distant. When parents have little knowledge of their adolescent's behavior, this leads to an increase in delinquency. Increases in delinquency, in turn, lead to decreases in parental knowledge, perhaps because delinquency often goes hand in hand with secrecy. In other words, the relationship between adolescent competence and authoritative parenting may be the result of a reciprocal cycle in which the child's psychosocial maturity leads to authoritative parenting, which in turn leads to the further development of maturity. In contrast, non authoritative parenting may lead to the development of emotional and behavioral problems, which may lead parents to disengage even more. So, our last slide, ethnic differences in parenting practices. A number of researchers have asked whether parents from different ethnic groups vary in their child rearing and whether the relation between parenting styles and adolescent outcomes is the same across different ethnic groups. These are two different questions. The first concerns average differences between groups in their approaches to parenting. For example, whether Asian parents are stricter than white parents, whereas the second concerns the correlation between parenting practices and adolescent adjustment in different groups. For example, whether the effect of strictness is the same in Hispanic families as it is in Black families. In general, authoritative parenting is less prevalent among Black, Asian, or Hispanic families than among white families. No doubt because parenting practices are often linked to cultural values and beliefs. Nevertheless, even though authoritative parenting is less common in ethnic minority families, its effects on adolescent adjustment are beneficial in all ethnic groups. In other words, ethnic minority youngsters benefit from parenting that is responsive and demanding, just as their non-minority peers do. Ethnic minority parents are also more demanding than white parents, even after taking ethnic differences in socioeconomic status into account, an approach exemplified, some may say caricatured, by a type of parent described as a tiger mother. As opposed to research on authoritative parenting, however, showing similar effects across ethnic groups, research on parental control indicates that the adverse effects of this style of parenting may be greater among white youngsters than among their ethnic minority counterparts. There are several explanations for this. First, because ethnic minority families are more likely to live in dangerous communities, authoritarian parenting, with its emphasis on control, may not be as harmful and may even offer some benefits. Second, definitions of parental control don't always make sense when applied to parents from different cultures. Because most of the research on parenting and adolescent development has been conducted by white researchers, other groups' approaches to child rearing, which appear very controlling, but which are neither aloof nor hostile. Okay, so just because it's controlling doesn't mean it's, like bad or hostile, right? It may be mislabeled as authoritarian when they're actually being better understood as like protective. Okay, so nevertheless, it's important to keep in mind that the conclusion to be drawn from these studies is not that overly controlling parenting is better than authoritative parenting for ethnic minority adolescents, but that it is not as harmful in these groups as it has been shown among white adolescents. And our last bullet point is autonomy and attachment in adolescents' family. Several studies of conversations between adolescents and their parents have examined factors in the nature of parent-adolescent communication that contribute to healthy adolescent development. In these studies, families are asked to discuss a problem together, and their interaction is videotaped and later analyzed. Families with psychologically competent teenagers interact in ways that permit family members to express their autonomy and individuality while remaining emotionally connected to other family members. Verbal give and take is the norm, and people are encouraged to express their own opinions even when this leads to disagreements. The importance of maintaining close relationship in the family is emphasized, however, and adolescents are encouraged to consider how their actions may affect others. Adolescents who are permitted to assert their own opinions within a family context that is secure and loving develop higher self-esteem and more mature coping abilities. Adolescents whose autonomy is squelched are at risk for developing feelings of depression and low self-esteem, whereas those who do not feel connected are more likely than their peers to develop behavior problems. In other words, adolescents appear to do best when they grow up in a family atmosphere that permits the development of individuality against a backdrop of close family ties. In these families, conflict between parents and adolescents can play a very important and positive role in the adolescent's social and cognitive development because individuals are encouraged to express their opinions in an atmosphere that does not risk severing the emotional attachment. Perhaps for this reason, adolescents whose perceptions of their family differ a little bit from those of their parents are better adjusted than those whose views are either identical to their parents or extremely divergent.